Deputy Stephen Donnelly. Deputy Donnelly, are you sharing time?
No, I'm not, Chair. I'll take it all. Governor, thank you. Thank you for your time today. Deputy Higgins, who obviously I would share my time with, has left for the chamber. Governor, I want to start and just touch briefly on the judgment yesterday, and I understand that there are constraints in what we can say, but I don't think there is on this. Judge Nolan said, quote, I find it it would be most unjust to jail these two men when I feel that a state agency, the financial regulator, had led the two men into error and illegality. Now, the most important words to me there, Governor, are led the two men into error and illegality. This is a very, very serious finding, and I've no doubt one you are looking at with great interest as the Governor of the Central Bank. Can I ask you, now that we have a judgment that says the Central Bank led two people to break the law, is it now time to call in on Garda Síochána and have a criminal investigation based on what the judge has said in his summing up yesterday?
All I'll say on that is that the Central Bank, before my time in 2009, commenced an investigation into these matters, including the matter that was dealt with in the court. And it was arising out of that investigation that the Central Bank passed all of the information available to it to the Gardaí on the suspicion that there had been some criminality. The matter is now entirely in the hands of the Gardaí. There is no additional data or searching that is required from the Central Bank's side. We have handed that matter over entirely to the Gardaí.
And do you expect the Gardaí, on the basis that the judge has publicly stated that the Central Bank led people to break the law, do you expect the Garda Síochána to now come back to look at prosecuting the Central Bank?
I think Deputy the Governor might have differently answered some of those questions, especially on behalf of the Gardaí or the EPP.
Entirely matter for other agencies.
Okay, thank you. Governor, before I make the comments I'm going to make, I want to acknowledge that I have the height of respect both for the position you hold and for you as an individual holding that position. However, based on the testimony we heard from the banks 2 weeks ago, based on the testimony we heard from the organisations which are trying to help borrowers in distress, based on everything else I've seen come through my own door and through various discussions we've had, I was very disappointed with your opening statement. Based on everything we've heard at this committee, were I a banker, I would be reasonably happy with your opening statement. Because to me it says, things are more or less going according to plan. We've identified 4 areas we need to change, and we're changing. But this certainly doesn't represent any call to arms. It doesn't represent, to me, any alarms going off in the Central Bank to say something is going quite seriously wrong and needs to be changed. And so were I some of the bankers who came before us 2 weeks ago, I'd be pretty happy. My interpretation would be the Central Bank is more or less okay with how we are proceeding with this. And consequently, were I a distressed borrower, or were I someone trying to help those borrowers, or indeed me as a TD, I'd be very disappointed with what I have heard today. I believe that the Central Bank is taking a hands-off approach, and let me explain why I think that. We know that the banks are allowed to define what a sustainable offer is within parameters set by the Central Bank, but they're given pretty broad remit to define what they think is sustainable. We know that the banks now have more or less unlimited contact with their customers because of the changes to the Code of Conduct of Mortgage Arrears. We know that not only can the banks veto any insolvency proposal that they want, they have stated that as a matter of policy, 2 of them will veto any insolvency proposal that has any inclusion of a write-down of secured debt. We know that the banks are allowed to categorise customers, Irish citizens, as uncooperating. And I believe this is not your fault, this is the fault of the legislation. In an outrageous situation Irish banks are allowed deny Irish citizens access to the legislative process of insolvency by saying, we've decided you're uncooperating. And we know that if a borrower wants to make an appeal against the actions of the bank, that appeal has to go to the bank, right? So I believe all of those things to be true. We also know that there's absolutely no consistency. We had the four main lenders in here last week. Bank of Ireland, we know, one of the deputies has already stated the interactions with Richie Boucher. We know that Bank of Ireland have said they'll veto any PIA that is proposed write-down of unsecured debt. We know Bank of Ireland's split mortgage is a farce. They charge the same interest on the shelved portion as they charge on the non-shelved portion. The figures presented by the banks show that Bank of Ireland's rate of legal proceedings initiated is 2 to 4 times higher than the other 3 banks. That's based on the information they provided. And I know, and we all know, that the difference between financial recovery and financial ruin for people dealing with unsustainable debt at the moment in Ireland comes down in large part to which bank you're dealing with. Now, you can be really unlucky and you can have had your loan sold to Lone Star or Oak Tree or any of the unregulated entry. You can be that unlucky, but you can also be unlucky and find yourself having to deal with Bank of Ireland as opposed to one of the other banks where you may get a deal. We know that there's very little quality, right? So we know that thousands of legal letters have gone out, and we know, Governor, that the vast majority of the so-called sustainable proposals are either legal letters or extend and pretend measures, interest only, recapitalisation of arrears, and so forth. And I don't believe that an approach to dealing with an unsustainable debt crisis is to increase the total payments over the course of those debt payments, which is essentially going on. So I've spoken a lot, but I would just like to ask you broadly, I hope that your sense of urgency and the central bank's sense of urgency is greater than we've heard here. So having said all of that, can I ask you, are you pretty much satisfied, or do you find it acceptable that there is so much inconsistency across the banks and how they're dealing? Do you find it acceptable that several of the banks are publicly stating that they're going to go against the spirit of the insolvency process? Do you find it acceptable that so few insolvency agreements have been agreed so far? And do you find it acceptable that the vast majority of so-called solutions are either legal threats or will actually increase the total amount of payments made by borrowers?
Okay. Well, perhaps the wording of my statement I can see how it may have looked. In fact, as I was reading it, I was saying, actually, this comes across a little bit more complacent than I would have intended. I think where, and the Cathaoirleach at the start mentioned that a year ago or a year and a quarter ago, I was talking about tearing my hair out and stuff like that. And after that, then we introduced this regime, this process, and I thought it would not be productive to make empty gestures of frustration, particularly when the process started to generate actual results. And although, you know, it's half full or half empty, or like an eighth full or 7/8 empty, there are actual deals being done. There are split mortgages, some more effective than others, but numbers in 4 figures on, you know, term extension, arrears, capitalisation. We have in the central bank engaged outsiders and our own staff to try to probe those to see, are they really viable? And we've rejected some of them, but there are viable ones being made. They're not all perfect. And I'm sure that the quality of the engagement and the quality of the communication, which is so crucial for the well-being of the borrower, is very mixed and uneven. But I do think that the process is getting traction, and the more cases that are done, the more people will learn from those, and converge on the most effective types of arrangement. It's a long haul, and I have no doubt that it's I'm afraid to use any words now after Deputy MacDonald. If I say unpleasant, people will think that I'm being condescending or something like that. But it's a very, very difficult and process for borrowers, and it's not being handled well. But it's being handled. Something is happening, and no doubt Deputy and other deputies are getting constituents who are coming in. Look what happened to me, particularly the ones that are not working. And I'm sure numerous cases are not working. We sampled a small sample. We found some that weren't working.
You see, there are the anecdotes. Let's just focus on the lack of consistency. We all have anecdotes, and we all have to be very careful about surmising conclusions from anecdotes. But we have far more than anecdotes. We've had the banks in here, and we know that there is inconsistency because it is their stated policy. Is it acceptable to you, as the Governor of the Central Bank, that Bank of Ireland, for example, doesn't offer 0% on the split mortgage where everyone else does? And if it's not acceptable, why don't you insist that they do what the other banks are doing?
Well, and we could change this and evolve it, but for the moment, the approach that we think in the Central Bank, I think, is to create a standard and allow that standard to be met. And if that appears to create differences, I don't find that objectionable, that there are differences, as long as an acceptable standard, and that's the sustainable standard and the sustainable restructuring, is achieved. I think if we manage that, if we really manage a sustainable solution that really works, then the fact that there are some differences between one person and another would be much less of a problem.
Why? Let me reframe the question. What disadvantage? There's an obvious problem here, which is a substantive unfairness in how people are being dealt with between the different banks. You can solve that. You have power under the Act that we passed here last year to insist on consistency of solutions. So why are you not insisting on consistency? What's the downside to it?
Supposing, I think my perspective on this is if we imposed a particular solution, which would be a one-size-fits-all type of solution, this would not sure I want to develop this point, but I see down the track there the pushback of the banks that could end up in constitutional challenge to their
So I'm not suggesting we have one solution and everybody has to follow one solution. I understand that we need a certain amount of variance. What is the downside to telling Bank of Ireland that they must charge 0% of the shell portion of the split mortgage, just like everybody else?
Well, supposing there is somebody there that could very nearly pay the debt entirely, why should Bank of Ireland say, well, I've just been told by the central bank I can't collect on this debt. The person can afford to pay the debt if I make my little sort of baby split mortgage arrangement, but now I've been told by the central bank that I have to give away a lot of value. It's moving away from regulation into property rights. But I'm not precluding that we could move tighter in that direction, but I think there has been a merit of allowing a variety of standards to meet different cases and exploit different ideas in different parts of the banking system.
Yeah, I agree that you need a suite of solutions, but the unfairness and the inconsistency.
Well, I think what you're saying, Deputy, is that some of the solutions you don't think are sustainable, and that will come out, and that has to be flushed out. That they don't actually satisfy the standards that we have set, which I think are high standards.
You see, that's well in theory, but that's not what's happening on the ground. What's happening on the ground is that the banks are coming in with their financial expertise and their legal expertise and their procedural expertise, and they're more or less bullying these borrowers into solutions. Now, not in every case and not in every bank, you know, but there's a level of leniency being allowed, I believe, by the central bank, which has at least one chief executive coming in here with an attitude that says, we can pretty much do what we want, and we can squeeze people, and the more we squeeze people, the more our share price goes up, and that's a good thing. And And you seem comfortable allowing that to happen.
I'm not sure that the behaviour is as different as the individual's projection of themselves is.
Well, as an example, Bank of Ireland is
insisting-
2 to 4 times the rate of legal proceedings of the others. That's the data.
It depends on what types of cases they are taking. So, okay, no, but I mean, there's no way this is working out perfectly, and I'm listening very closely to the comments of the deputies as I listen to other comments. But progress is being made. I think it's not going backwards; it's going forwards, and as things improve in the quality of the engagement, in the selection of solutions, I think that progress can accelerate, and that there. But I'm not excluding a tightening or a strengthening of our code and our definition of sustainability.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Deputy.